Um, Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Morrow with the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining our webinar on public perceptions of carbon removal. We are fortunate to be joined here today by Kaitlin Raimi of the University of Michigan, Rob Bellamy, the University of Manchester, and we should be joined shortly by Leah Wanambwa of the African Union Commission. Our webinar today will start with short presentations from each of our speakers, followed by discussion between the three of them. At any point, you can add your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to those questions a bit later in the hour. Kaitlin, why don't you take it away?
All right, great. So let me just get myself situated here. So first, thanks so much for having this event. This is exciting to get to talk about public perceptions of carbon removal. So I just wanted to go over a few kind of key themes that I've seen that emerge in the literature on public perceptions of carbon removal. And I'll just note one theme is that this has largely been done on publics from the US, the UK, Europe, and Australia. So it's not a global public perceptions of, at least in terms of what I'll be talking about here. So the first major point is that most people have no perception of carbon removal. There is very little public perception of this. Studies that have looked at people's self-reported prior awareness of carbon removal, have they ever heard of this before the study, find somewhere between like 14 to 20% of people indicating that they've ever heard of this before, or that they have, at least a fair amount of knowledge. So really, this is an area where most people haven't really formed a perception yet. So there's a lot of room to grow there. And I'll also note, in general, people tend to overclaim knowledge rather than underclaim it. So this, if anything, is probably an exaggeration of people's awareness of this topic. When they do hear about it, their support for it varies a lot. So they're not as wary of carbon removal as they are of like solar geoengineering, but it varies a lot, partly based on the technologies that are being talked about. So for example, one study found that in terms of supporting research on carbon removal, somewhere between 40 to 45% of people indicated that they supported it. And this is a multi-country sample. Other research has looked at whether people support deployment of carbon removal, and it ranges a lot. So there's one study from Germany that found 53% of people supported BECCS, but another study from Germany found up to 80% of people supported afforestation. So again, it may depend on the strategy being talked about. Afforestation in general seems to get more support than some other approaches for reasons that we can talk about. So my next point is that because people have such low knowledge of carbon removal, the initial framing of these strategies has a really big impact on how people think about it. Not surprisingly, when you've never heard of something before, the way it's introduced initially has a big effect. So one major frame is how natural things are, and I think Rob is going to talk about that a bit more, so I'll leave that to him. But other frames that are important are who is in charge. So the public generally seems to prefer carbon removal led by academic scientists rather than for-profit industry, who they're a little suspicious of sometimes. Also framing of the trade-offs. So are they being told about the costs and potential risks as well as the benefits of carbon removal? Not surprisingly, that makes a difference. And the alternatives that are framed are also super important. So is this being talked about just as one alternative that might either take the place or be an addition to things like renewable energy, or is it being talked about as like this is the only stopgap measure between us and a huge climate crisis, an emergency, right? This is of course going to have a big impact on how people think about these new approaches. Another theme that emerges both when experts talk about carbon removal and when the lay public does is fears about moral hazards. So everybody, when they hear about this or when they talk about this, fears that other people will not worry so much about reducing emissions if they learn about carbon removal. They think that If other people learn about carbon removal, they'll feel like this is a silver bullet that will take care of the problem, and they'll wash their hands of it and don't need to do anything else. The empirical work that's looked at moral hazards, including my own, has been really mixed. So we sometimes find that learning about carbon removal can reduce people's perceived threat of climate change, and in turn reduce emission reduction support. But we don't always find it. These aren't robust and they're small effects. Research in other areas like solar geoengineering sometimes actually finds the opposite effect, that it can actually increase support for emission reductions. And my own work finds that, again, it's just about framing. So if you tell people this is a silver bullet that's going to take care of the problem, they believe you. And if you tell people this is just a piece of the puzzle, then those moral hazard effects start to disappear. So again, I think this is about how these are described to people. The last point I want to make is that is about a theme that doesn't emerge in carbon removal, which is political ideology. When we talk about climate change, political ideology has a huge impact on people and public perceptions, especially in the US and other Anglophone countries. People on the right and the left have very different perceptions of climate change. That does not seem to have leaked into discussions of carbon removal, at least not yet. And we can talk about why that might be later on, but I just wanted to flag that as one major difference when we're talking about carbon removal in particular. So with that, I'll stop and let other people take the floor.
Thanks, Kaitlin. Let's turn it over to Rob next.
Thanks, David, and the Institute as well for having me. It's great to be here. Okay, so I'm going to outline 3 things shaping public perceptions of carbon removal that I think are perhaps less well recognized, but I think will play an increasingly important role going forward. And these are firstly, the social construction of nature. Secondly, the socio-bit of socio-technical systems. And thirdly, the co-production of public perceptions research itself. So let's start with the social construction of nature. One of the most consistent and recurrent findings of public perceptions research on carbon removal has been that people prefer options that are perceived as being natural over options that are perceived as being technological or unnatural. So people prefer things like afforestation and biochar over things like direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But what's less well recognized is that natural climate solutions aren't some self-evident category. What's contained within is something selected by people. And here's the problem. Nature is universal. It encapsulates the physical world in its entirety, including both untouched nature and nature modified by humans, as well as, of course, humans themselves. So any effort to establish some subset of nature as the one true nature will be missing a big part of the picture. Advocates of natural climate solutions exclude articles manufactured from nature, such as direct air capture and storage and low carbon concrete, as well as approaches that should fall under their own definition, such as ocean alkalinity enhancement and enhanced weathering. And then there's more ambiguous approaches that suffer inconsistencies like biochar, burial, and BECCS, which, for example, both involve enhancing an existing natural process, biomass growth, and articles manufactured from nature, pyrolysis plants in the case of biochar, and power stations combined with carbon capture and storage in the case of BECCS. But biochar is classed as a natural solution and BECCS is not. So we're simultaneously presented with a risk and an opportunity. The appeal of nature, combined with a restricted set of options, risks constraining what are thought of as desirable, fundable, implementable policy options. But an awareness of its social construction gives us an opportunity too for articulating a broader, more inclusive understanding of nature that opens up the range of options rather than closing it down, which is vital because I think we all recognize that we're going to need everything we can get in order to tackle the climate crisis. So next we have what I've called the socio-bit of socio-technical systems. Public perceptions research on carbon removal, in fact on any kind of new technology, has long focused on how people view technical characteristics. So what's wrong with that? Well, technologies aren't just isolated bits of kit that work on their own. They're socio-technical systems, combinations of technical objects and social arrangements that work together as a single system. Carbon removal won't work without people, procedures, policies, policy instruments, and so on. So we're starting to know quite a bit about how people perceive the bits of kit, the technical characteristics, but very little has been done so far to highlight and understand how people see the other half of socio-technical systems. And what has been done shows that it can be decisive. So the policy instruments chosen to incentivize BECS, for example, have been shown to significantly change the way people perceive the technology itself. So unfortunately, it's of limited use to say that people think X about a carbon removal approach if we haven't also looked at what people think about its possible implementation contexts. And then lastly, there's the co-production of public perceptions research itself. So this refers to how it's important to not only pay attention to how public perceptions research frames or constructs the objects under consideration, such as carbon removal options and their attendant framings, but also to consider how research constructs the publics and procedural formats of public participation as well, and in turn how these construct the research. Public perceptions research has tended to focus on opinion surveys, consultations, deliberative processes, and public dialogues, but this misses out on a huge diversity of public participation that's going on all the time around us. But the perceptions within each of those remain overlooked. So think about activist groups, protests, artistic engagements, action groups, cooperatives, community groups, maker spaces, living laboratories, and digital engagement, to name a few. In short, public perceptions research is only tapping into a small part of the bigger picture, and addressing this will be key if we are to ever fully understand public perceptions of and responsibly develop carbon removal. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Now, we were hoping to have Leah Wanambwa give a short presentation as well. She'd messaged us right before the webinar started to say she was having some network problems. Hopefully she will be able to join us and we can sort of drop whatever we're talking about at the moment and have her tell us a bit about how carbon removal is being perceived among policymakers, especially within the African Union. But in the meantime, could I invite the two of you, Kaitlin and Rob, to say a bit about what you see as the main drivers of public perceptions of carbon removal right now. So you've mentioned some of these things, but I'd be interested in, say, top three. That could be something you mentioned, something the other person mentioned, or something that just hasn't come up yet.
I mean, I think Rob certainly talked about this, but I think the nature perceptions is maybe the major driver right now. I think it's both in terms of like how official categorizations are given and how the lay public kind of intuitively understands these approaches. Nature, the perception of the naturalness has a huge impact. And I think it's not just the perception that any particular approach is natural or tampers with nature, but also people's kind of individual differences and how comfortable they are with nature-based approaches versus non-nature-based approaches. So people differ in how much they are scared of things that tamper with the natural world, and that independently of how much they think any particular strategy tampers affects their support for them. So I think that's super important. We also, there's studies that have looked at framing of naturalness, and it's a very malleable thing into how natural something is. You can describe the same exact process as being natural or not. And so that really affects public perceptions. So I think Rob's very right to say that these are kind of arbitrary categories, both at the kind of expert level, but also at the lay audience level.
Rob?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I was going to say, actually, in terms of the most impactful issue at the moment, I was going to pick one of yours, Kaitlin. I think I think the nature thing is going to be very, very big going forward. But I think right now, my sense is that the most significant thing that is starting to shape and could be really impactful going forward is the moral hazard issue. Just because I think it's being, yeah, I mean, the whole kind of moral hazard thing is just really coming to the fore at the moment. I mean, this isn't to say I necessarily think it's going to be a big problem in the future. I think we really just need to allay any of the concerns that people have about that. And I think there's some really useful work going on around kind of policy innovations that could kind of go some way to addressing this. So Duncan McLaren and colleagues, for example, have proposed separating emissions reductions and removals in terms of policy goals. And I think that kind of stuff really needs to come forward, and hopefully the policymakers will listen to that and deal with it. But in the meantime, there is this very real risk, and we're already seeing kind of people and companies talking about kind of offsets and things. And if this space isn't governed properly, it could lead to a very real risk around moral hazard. And I think people will obviously be rightly concerned about that. You go, Kaitlin.
Yeah, no, just to build on that, I think people talk about moral hazard a lot in a very simplified way with a lot of assumptions. I think there's different types of moral hazards. There's the kind of how the public's going to react. There's how policymakers might trade things off. There's just like actual budgets of where money might go. There's lots of different ways that moral hazards could play in, but moral hazard, like the framing, the language of that assumes it's going in a negative direction, that it's a crowding out effect. And I actually am not sure that that's always the case. So we sometimes, as I talked about, see this like risk enhancement, risk salience kind of effect, where people see these things, they see that some of them are very costly, or some of them might be scary, or some of them might be whatever that they don't like. And that makes them even more concerned about climate change and want to turn to emission reductions instead. And so I don't know that it's always inherently has to be in the kind of reducing support for policies, emission reduction policies. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think it's important to look at. Obviously, we don't want to talk about something and have it undermine all of the efforts we're doing on climate change. But I do fear that it's oversimplified in a way that, I don't know, might stymie efforts to even talk about this stuff and communicate and inform the public about this.
Yeah, and that would also link, I think, to one of your other points about political ideology. It's interesting how at the moment it is a little bit open to being shaped in that way, I think. But you can already kind of see some groups starting to kind of I suppose demonize or kind of advocate from particular kind of political standpoints. So you can kind of see where this is starting to go at the moment. But as you say, we're at a really kind of nice point at the moment where we can kind of reflect on these things and maybe kind of steer things in a more productive direction, and hope that it doesn't become a kind of a partisan issue of some kind, because at the end of the day, you kind of due to kind of the existence of residual emissions and so on, we're probably going to have to use some kind of carbon removal, and we kind of, it wouldn't be very productive to have it sectioned off as a kind of something that we don't want to do.
Yeah, I have very little hope that it'll stay unpolitical. I don't think anything stays unpolitical these days, but it hasn't yet evolved into that. I mean, it's really interesting. Carbon removal, and like, it's really interesting in that it can be a technology defined approach. And so there's been some research to suggest that might be more, that people like that, who don't like, if you don't like big government, you don't want the policy approaches, that maybe something that sounds like it's kind of more of a techie approach is going to be more appealing. And so some initial work suggested that appeal to hierarchical individualists who tend to be more politically conservative, for example. But those studies are like really, it's like almost like setting up a moral hazard. They explicitly say like, this is in lieu of doing the policies. They're not setting it up as like, this is an addition. And so I think in a real world situation where these things are coupled, I'm not sure that that will take off in quite the same way. I don't know that that'll be quite so appealing to people on the political right as it might be without that context.
Yeah, and the US, of course, is a particularly interesting context for these kind of polarizing discussions. I mean, in the UK, for example, I think it's a lot less of a, I mean, climate change is a lot less of a partisan issue. There are some kind of issues, but it's not anywhere near as significant. So that's another kind of key dimension here, of course, is, you know, how carbon removal is going to be perceived and received in different countries. And if Leah joins us, then it'd be great to kind of hear about the perspective of the global South as well, because as Kaitlin mentioned, like pretty much all of there have been some exceptions, but most of the research done in this space is focused on you know, people from the US or the UK and maybe Europe as well. Yeah, and then there's also a kind of separate discussion that's kind of a personal interest to me, which is the extent to which there are differences, or which is bigger, the kind of differences between countries or the differences within countries. So Kaitlin, you mentioned the you know, how individualists, for example, might be more prone to being open to these kinds of technologies. So obviously you have individualists in different countries as well. So it's kind of, maybe they have more in common with each other than yeah, the kind of differences between countries. So there was a couple of other things I just wanted to highlight, though. So following on from what I was saying, I think going forward, when it comes to this nature issue, I think we've got this kind of risk and opportunity, where, you know, if things carry on as they are, then we're kind of faced with a situation where we've got this area of what being described as natural climate solutions, which, you know, are imbued with this kind of higher level of public acceptance, and it was going to risk this kind of constraining of policy options, I think, going forward. And that's before you get onto all of those issues around you know, monitoring, verification, and reporting, and the kind of impermanence of the storage around some of those techniques. But what I would really like to see is kind of as challenging this, on the one hand, the way in which experts are kind of framing this new category, but also from a kind of public perceptions research point of view. I'm quite interested, because Kaitlin, you mentioned that you know, there is a kind of popular understanding of nature as well, which in my mind is kind of a legacy of romanticism. So we've got this kind of incumbent perception of nature almost that kind of needs to be revisited, I think. But it's whether or not we can overcome that is another matter.
Thanks. That'll make a good segue to one of our audience questions. So I want to turn shortly to those questions. For the audience members, if you have questions that you would like Kaitlin or Rob or hopefully Leah to be able to answer, go ahead and add them in that Q&A box, and we will get to them shortly. Before we do that, there was one question I wanted to ask you two, following on things you've both talked about, which is about how long these framing effects last. Right? So if I don't know anything about carbon removal and I read an article that describes, say, enhanced weathering as accelerating the natural process by which rocks take carbon out of the air, how long does that effect last? Are we talking like days, weeks, months, forever? Is it reversible? Right? How does this work?
I think that's a good question, by which I mean I don't have a clear answer for you. I think it depends on the context a lot. So we know about, for framing about climate change, where there is a lot of information that people are exposed to all the time, the framing effects really don't seem to last super long there because they're immediately kind of overturned by alternative information. And so, you know, they can nudge people a little bit for a short amount of time, but then they kind of get overrun. I think if you're talking about enhanced weathering and somebody's hearing about this and they're not hearing anything else about it for weeks, then that may stay with them until however long until they hear something else. And it could become even more sticky because then it's been there for longer and it's been kind of deeply ingrained as their first impression. And we know people's first impressions are maybe the most impactful. So I think for carbon removal, especially things that are less familiar, like enhanced weathering, that can be pretty sticky for a while, especially right now when people haven't heard about it. I think once we get into a situation where these things are being debated and talked about a lot more and people are reading lots of stories about it, I think then any framing effects are going to be you're going to get diminishing returns there.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kaitlin there. I think that, you know, the duration aspect is key, which is why it's really important that we kind of have these conversations now. Although, of course, when it comes to the nature thing, as I say, it's kind of, at least in the public imagination, it's kind of a legacy of this romanticism, which has been around for centuries. So I think, you know, how long does that framing effect last? Very long time. Are we going to be able to get over it? I don't know. I would really like to be able to, and you know, it's a personal research interest of mine to try and do that. So it's, in a way, it's a kind of an empirical question, I think, and as Kaitlin says, you know, it depends on the context.
Great. So we do actually have an audience question about this nature tech divide, asking how this has changed over time and why. I'm guessing that Mark has a less long-term question in mind here. So it's not about romanticism, it's about, you know, the last probably 10, 15 years or so. How have perceptions about nature versus technological carbon removal changed? Why? And to what extent are we seeing efforts to shift that, successful or not?
Well, yeah, so I think the emergence of this has been really in the last few years. So we were having a little discussion just before this webinar started, where I was just reflecting on how you know, the terminology's changed over the last decade or so. So if you look back to 2009, you know, the geoengineering kind of burst onto the scene, which historically is a kind of, on the one hand, you've got solar geoengineering technologies, on the other hand, you've got carbon removal stuff. And then a few years later, you kind of had this decoupling that is largely complete at this point. I think where people are kind of, when people say geoengineering, most of the time they mean solar geoengineering. But then we're seeing another split as well. So around about, it was 2017, there was this key article by Griscom et al. On natural climate solutions, which was really the first point at which this separation between the natural and the kind of technological carbon removal started. So again, we're starting to see another split within carbon removal. So it's quite recent, this natural thing, and also I've noticed in some circles that I walk in that people are starting to just put natural climate solutions in with this broader nature-based solutions category, which is not just about carbon removal. That also includes kind of mitigation and adaptation options as well. But yeah, so there's that split going on, and I think, you know, eventually we'll get to a point where we can start talking about the merits of individual technologies, which is where things need to be going, I think, rather than having these high-level discussions about kind of big groups of technologies, of which the criticisms and evaluations are sometimes hold, but there's often big differences between the individual approaches that really need to be drawn out. So what was the last part of that question?
About efforts to change the perceptions?
Oh, efforts to change. Yeah, okay. So nothing really has been done, as far as I'm aware, to try and change that, apart from some kind of studies. Well, there have been some interesting studies that have looked at the impacts of framing things as natural or otherwise. But this is something that's really well established now. I think everybody knows that if you frame something as natural, it's going to be perceived as being better. But what really interests me and what I want to try and do in the next few years is to try and change the way people think about that. What I really want to do is to redirect people to evaluating these technologies and approaches on their merits rather than under this kind of label of nature, because nature, the way when nature's invoked, it kind of imbues it with this sense of moral authority, or and it protects it from proper scrutiny, because it's kind of people like things that are natural. I mean, who's against nature, right? so it's what would be really nice is to focus on the specific reasons why we would or wouldn't want to do any of these approaches.
I think Rob covered most of it, but I'll just add on to say that I think the nature framing, like the importance of that, is likely to dissipate as tech approaches get actually used on the ground. We see a lot of people think in terms of values and morals and ideologies when they're talking about abstract constructs. But when it's actually brought on the ground and there's local decisions being made about siting, is there going to be enhanced weathering going on in my area? Is there going to be reforestation going on my land? Like that, then people take different approaches to decision making and focus much more on the concrete. Like, what is this going to mean for my bottom line? What is this going to mean for my personal health or my family's health? Like those sorts of things become much more important, and the larger values become much less of a driver. So I think as things get more real and more local, the priorities might change a bit, and the focus on these kind of big abstract ideas, I think, will become less important, and the focus on money and land and local politics will become much more important.
Thanks. What do we know at the moment about how carbon removal is being framed in public discourse? So we've talked a bit about how people respond to different kinds of messages, but do we know what kind of messages people are currently getting about carbon removal?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on which circles you're moving in, but I mean, in my circles, it tends to be this kind of moral hazard thing. So people are kind of, you get people saying, the kind of critics kind of saying, oh, it's a risk to reducing emissions, which at the moment it is, without these kind of policy innovations. I mean, I think certainly within kind of, from the research community, I think as Kaitlin said already, I don't think anybody really presents these things as being an alternative to mitigation. So that's a really kind of positive thing, I think, coming out of the research community. It's always kind of emphasized that it's it's additional. Mitigate first, and as much and as fast as you can, and then whatever's left you kind of mop up with carbon removal. So I think from the research community, that I don't know, I'd maybe dare to go as far as to say that was a universal kind of framing from the research community. But then, yeah, it starts becoming more complicated when you get out into stakeholder communities, and I think, yeah, from the critics' point of view, they're kind of emphasizing this risk that it might become a moral hazard, and then you've got kind of companies like fossil fuel companies who are kind of talking about these offsets and things, and maybe aren't as tuned to the concerns as they should be.
Yeah, I would just add that most people are not hearing about this at all. So I think that's the biggest thing, is people just aren't really hearing about this. And if they are, they maybe are seeing ads from Exxon about offset sort of CCS rather than carbon removal in a permanent kind of way. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We've got a set of questions from a bunch of different audience members circling around sort of specific issues associated with either carbon removal in general or particular approaches. And they're wondering how these things affect or might affect people's perceptions of carbon removal. So I think I might just sort of give you a list here of things that people have raised, and you can pick or choose or ask me what else was on the list. So things that people have raised: geological sequestration and concerns about the safety of geological sequestration. People want to know how the idea of, say, carbon trading might affect public perceptions, especially around issues of, say, the difficulty of accounting for carbon trading, right? So are they sort of real offsets, that sort of concern? Questions about side effects. Kaitlin alluded to this in talking about what happens when sort of things become less abstract and more concrete. And those could include both physical side effects, but also what you might think of as social side effects. Someone mentioned, say, land grabs in the global south. Questions about enhanced oil recovery, right? This process where you take captured carbon dioxide and inject it into oil and gas wells to enhance production. And environmental justice, either in the context of EJ concerns for particular carbon removal projects, or sort of climate change itself as an environmental justice issue and the connection to carbon removal. If people in the audience have other sort of specific issues in this area that they want to ask Kaitlin and Rob about, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A and I'll add them to the list. So it's a bunch of things. Pick and choose what you think is most sort of interesting or important, or what you have the most to say about.
Don't have answers for most of those. I'm getting great ideas for studies. I'd say a couple things that I flagged. So I think enhanced oil recovery, anything that is related to the oil industry in this space, I think people are often very suspicious of, and for good reason. And so I think anytime any oil industry action, whether it's enhanced oil recovery or ads about carbon capture or whatever, I think people have an initial aversion to, and that is going to decrease support for any of those approaches. Again, they like academic scientists doing this because it's seen as more neutral and not, there's not some ulterior motive that's causing this. So I think that's one area that I see. For some of the other stuff in terms of side effects and environmental justice concerns, I think it really depends on which part of the process we're talking about. I think people are likely to have different concerns about different links in the chain. So this is not carbon removal in terms of carbon, like what we've been talking about, but I have been doing some work on products, CCU products, carbon capture being used to create products, and looking at focus groups on people's perceptions of those, which again, these are products that get used. So there's lots of links there. People get really worried about health impacts, both in terms of how these things are created and in terms of like the products themselves. People sometimes worry about like carbon leaking out of them in the same way they might worry about leaking out of like a geological sequestration. And so I think there are definitely some health fears that are kind of, not well formed, but just kind of vague ideas that maybe something could happen here that could be dangerous. But also real concerns if we're thinking about kind of point source capture or other things that are tied again to industrial processes. People worry that could be, the communities around those industries could be affected. And so I think any kind of the creation of any carbon capture, whether it's for permanent storage or use, I think where those are located and who the communities are around there is going to affect a lot about how much people are worried about side effects there. And that those fears could be real or imagined, but both of those would have impacts on whether those are supported in those communities or surrounding communities.
Yeah, I just echo what Kaitlin was saying, really. I think there's quite a lot of interesting future research questions in there, particularly around the environmental justice issue, I think. This is a kind of a relatively new kind of voice that's been given a lot more of a platform in recent years. So I think it'd be very interesting to see, how kind of carbon removal is seen from an environmental justice point of view, but also, how can carbon removal be imbued with environmental justice values as well. So it's all part and parcel of this approach of, how can we, given the fact that we probably are going to have to do carbon removal in some form, how can we do that responsibly? Yeah, so I would say just a couple of things. So the geological sequestration question is an interesting one. This is something that kind of often crops up around bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and direct air carbon capture and storage, both of which, of course, use the geological storage mechanism. So it's a concern with both of those. And it also links to another kind of thing that kind of circulates around perceptions of carbon removal and new technologies, and that is the issue of analogies. So people often draw on analogies to make sense of new technologies and things that they're not familiar with. So when it comes to things that use geological sequestration, what people have found is that people often draw on their knowledge and experiences of nuclear power and radioactive waste disposal. So they think about, how long, if you remove this carbon from the air, how long are we going to have to keep it sequestered for? And concerns about the safety of that storage. How permanent is it? Of course, it is a lot more permanent in theory than some of the natural climate solutions, but people are concerned about kind of leakages and things like that. And then side effects. So this is probably the big one, I think, for carbon removal. Aside from the kind of the moral hazard issue at this point, I think most people are really, once they've been told about these approaches, people start getting a bit concerned about some of the potential side effects. So some of the classic ones, I think you already mentioned, David, about kind of land use issues for things that require large land areas, like. Well, I was going to give an example then, actually, but I'm going to I'm going to challenge this, because one of the big assumptions around carbon removal has been that you have to do it at an absolutely crazy scale, and that's not necessarily true. So interestingly, you've got the IPCC scenarios on meeting 1.5 degrees and things like that, and of course, one of the big controversies around that is that the scenarios that actually meet the Paris Agreement goals rely on a huge amount of carbon dioxide removal, and not just kind of any carbon dioxide removal, specifically bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That accounts for more than half of the amount of carbon removal, and then also a huge amount of afforestation as well. So the two approaches that have been included in those scenarios are both involve huge amounts of land area. And I think someone I read somewhere at some point that the amount of bioenergy you'd have to produce would cover the size of India or something in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. We could mitigate, but more importantly, in the real world, I don't think anybody's going to implement BECCS on the scale of covering India in biomass. It's just not going to happen. So these critiques about land area, you have to be mindful of it being kind of set up in a kind of straw manish kind of way. That's not to say that there aren't land use issues. There are wherever it would be deployed, but it's pretty unlikely it's going to be done on the scale that is envisaged in the integrated assessment models. But then, interestingly, you've got some of the more controversial approaches, particularly on the marine carbon removal side of things. You've got probably the most hated of all of the carbon removal options, I think, is ocean iron fertilization, which has been roundly condemned by members of the public. And I think most researchers in this area as well have come to see this as an option that's technically, it hasn't really been proven that it can store that much carbon in the first place, but also whether it can keep it there. And that's before you get onto these side effects issues around kind of, toxic algal blooms, impacts on marine food web dynamics, and then changes to ocean chemistry and things like that. So some of these are more kind of concerning than others in terms of their impacts. But I think, as people start learning more about these things, these impacts or potential impacts will start coming to the fore more, I think.
Just one other point to add on into the environmental justice conversation is that I think this is one reason why it's so important that the Global South be included in these conversations, because the research that we're drawing on to think about what are people concerned about for environmental justice concerns are from people in largely the US and UK. And that's going to be very different concerns than people in Kenya or India or Brazil. And so I think we really need to, both in terms of the amount that people are concerned about the things that we've identified, but also other things that we haven't yet identified because we've been looking at particular subsets of the population, I think is super important as we consider this, especially like whose land are we going to be using and where might these things be happening. So I think really vital to have that as part of the conversation.
That's a nice segue, Kaitlin, to one of the other questions here. Before I ask that one, I just want to flag one sort of point of intersection between the EJ conversation and something we talked about earlier. One of the big concerns that a lot of EJ advocates have connects directly to moral hazard and the environmental justice implications of continued fossil fuel use. And so it's not just about what happens from particular carbon removal projects or about the ways those could contribute positively to sort of reducing the EJ impacts of climate change. But there's also this concern about how any moral hazard effect, as it's usually conceived, would perpetuate the environmental injustices associated with fossil fuel use. The question I wanted to segue to here is that is about this point of including a broader array of publics in public perception research, what Kaitlin just raised. And the questioner asks, does this consideration of public groups change our understandings of nature or the moral hazard problem or any other dimensions on carbon removal? And I'd like to slot in another question here, asking not necessarily about different publics, but different pieces of public. So there's a question about different generations and their responses to framing issues. So how might we expect things to change as we look at a broader array of publics or at different slices of those publics?
I think it would absolutely change. It's hard for me to really anticipate how, because we don't have those voices yet. I mean, even within the populations we study, so like even within the US, we know that some groups think of environmental issues very differently than others. So there's a great paper looking at what counts as an environmental issue, finding within the US sample that like what white people think is an environmental issue is different than what Black or Latinx or Asian communities think of as an environmental issue. What counts as part of that process is going to be different. And so I think the same is likely to be true for carbon removal and for probably any other topic, that different people are going to have different perspectives. They're going to interpret terms differently. Their values are going to be different. The analogies that they're drawing on are going to be different. And so all of those are going to affect their perceptions in ways that, you know, as somebody from my particular perspective and who's done research on particular populations, I don't feel like I can actually anticipate without having actually asked them.
Yeah, I'd just second that really. I mean, yeah, how might things change as we include more publics? It's an empirical question. I think once we start kind of broadening out to include all those different voices, then picture will start to change. And then how will things change as people, as more publics are included? Substantively in terms of the perceptions, I don't think we can anticipate that too much at this point. But what we can say is that as a result of including all of those voices, you're going to have what we call a more socially robust kind of platform from which to make decisions. Because of course all of these perceptions are kind of feeding into decision making and influencing kind of how people, how policymakers make their selections and things. So this is my concern about the kind of the natural framing, of course, is that if policymakers think everybody likes this subset of natural climate solutions, then we might end up disproportionately kind of putting our eggs in those baskets. But yeah, so it's all about kind of making more robust decisions, I think, and including those different voices will help with that.
So we need more research and more researchers in more places.
Yes.
I know typically you're supposed to end with saying, and we need more research, but we have more questions and more time. So let's try to fit in at least a few more of these here. Someone asks about parallels from perception research in biomedical engineering, so synthetic biology, for instance, on the debate of this nature versus tech trade-off. I wonder if you know of any or can comment on any parallels there, or if you have other parallels you want to mention, that would be great too.
I've done some work looking at people's underlying base level discomfort with tampering with natural things in general. So, and they're tied together. So people's fears about synthetic biology or nanoparticles or vaccines or geoengineering or pesticides, anything that people see as tampering with nature, there's this underlying core fear that kind of moves around regardless of the context that drives some decisions there. Obviously, contexts are going to be different for medical situations where people are putting things into their body versus environmental situations where it's not. But I do think there's some things do tend to move around together, and then there's kind of fluctuation around that based on the context. So I do think these things can be connected.
Anything to add there, Rob?
Yeah, no, I'd reiterate that point. Yeah, nature kind of, it's a big theme in all of these kind of things, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that when it comes to public perceptions research, I think the gold standard is kind of going out and talking to people about these things. But there's also quite a significant body of literature that's looked at, how people perceive technologies and approaches in kind of different situations. And there's certain things that kind of keep cropping up across all of these different approaches. So we know there's kind of sets of common concerns that people have about new technologies and things. So just for example, there's tons of these things. But just for example, another one is encapsulation. So whether or not something releases materials into the environment. People tend not to like things that release materials. They prefer kind of black box, self-contained kind of approaches. But there's a very long list of kind of things like that where we know that people tend to think about new things in certain ways.
Great. In our last few minutes, we have one question asking about studies on framing carbon removal. What I might do there is ask each of you after the webinar to send me, say, top 5 studies you would recommend that people read, and we'll put those in an email out to everyone who had registered for the webinar. There's also a question asking if you know of available resources for messaging best practices, especially based on audience in the carbon removal space. Anything off the top of your head? If not, we can add that to an email as well.
Messaging. Uh, yeah, I don't think anyone's come up with a resource for this, but it's an interesting question. And I think it depends on your goals, of course, and what you're trying to achieve. From my kind of perspective, I think you can probably guess what I'm going to say, which is to try and avoid the natural framing. Unless, of course, you want people to like it without properly scrutinizing it, in which case use it all you like.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think this area is still new enough that there haven't been it hasn't yet gotten out of the academic literature into the like best practices for communicators out in the world. But now you're making us feel like we need to do that.
All right. And one last question that's come in here that we can answer quickly. We've been talking about sort of the layperson's perception of carbon removal. And one audience member asked how much influence the layperson's understanding has on the implementation of the tech.
I think there are certainly examples where lay people have formed activist groups that have had huge impacts on whether technology is dispersed or how easily it's dispersed. Sometimes it's overridden, but with a lot of resistance. So, there's examples of things like, 5G being opposed, or people opposing, transmission lines because of fears about health impacts of those that really get in the way of policymakers or industry who are trying to implement these technologies. So I think it depends on what people do with their perceptions, if they're really motivated to act on them and try and push back against things that they see happening that they don't approve of, or push for things that they are very excited about. There are other things that people may have opinions about, but they don't see it as priority enough to act on. And so carbon removal may fit into those. But we see it in all sorts of places related to climate change as well. So things like wind turbines being opposed in communities that don't want them to obscure their view or whatever. So I think it can, these public perceptions can have a big impact, especially again, when we get to the siting level of like, is this going to be allowed in this particular community or on this particular land?
Yeah, exactly. I'd look at all the various examples, analogous examples of other technologies that have been coming forward over the years and come across public opposition or things like that. There's history's replete with examples of technologies that have had a problematic entry into society, and I think nuclear energy is another interesting one. We've already mentioned how people think about that in terms of the geological sequestration stuff, but also I just point back to this this point that it's not kind of just about the technology; it's about the implementation context as well. So in the UK, we've got an example of there's a new nuclear power station called Hinkley Point that's been coming forward for a while, and there's quite a lot of public opposition around that. Not just because it's nuclear, but also because of the way in which it's being done, which is with a particular kind of policy instrument that has placed a huge burden on the public taxpayer. So there's lessons to be learned there, I think.
All right, great. That does bring us to the end of our hour. This webinar has been recorded. It will be posted to our website, carbonremoval.info. It's carbon removal, all one word, .info, where you'll be able to find this webinar and our previous webinars and learn about upcoming webinars and about the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy in general. I'd like to thank both of our panelists today, Kaitlin Raimi of the University of Michigan and Rob Bellamy from the University of Manchester. We are very sorry that we were not able to be joined by Leah Wanamwa of the African Union Commission today. We will try to find a way to share her perspective with you as well. Thanks to all of you for your time and attention, and I hope you all have a good day.